There is a particular kind of honesty that only becomes possible in a very quiet room. Not the honesty of a confession or an argument or a difficult conversation arranged in advance. The other kind, the kind that visits in the early hours of a morning when sleep has slipped away and the house is completely still and there is nothing between you and your own thoughts except the dark and the sound of your own breathing. That is the room I am describing. And most people over 70 have sat inside it more times than they will ever mention to another living soul. My dear friends, there are things that people carry at this stage of life that never make it into conversation. Not because the people carrying them are dishonest, many of them are among the most decent and thoughtful people I have ever known, but because some things belong to a category of truth that feels too private, too late, or too tender to lift into the ordinary daylight of a regular afternoon. These are the regrets that get acknowledged behind closed eyes rather than across kitchen tables. The ones that visit quietly and leave without being named out loud. I want to speak about them today, carefully and without judgment. Because I have sat in that quiet room myself, and I believe there is something valuable in knowing that what you carry there is not as unusual as the silence around it suggests. The first thing people over 70 regret, though they will rarely say so directly, is how little they actually said to the people they loved most while they still had the ordinary Tuesday to say it in. Not the speeches, not the toasts at weddings or the cards sent dutifully on birthdays. The unremarkable, unhurried, nothing in particular moments of simply telling a parent, a sibling, or an old friend what they genuinely meant. Most people assume there will be a better moment later, a quieter afternoon, a longer phone call when work slows down, a visit that keeps getting scheduled for next month, and then one day without adequate warning, the ordinary Tuesday runs out, and all that remains is the unsaid things sitting in a room that nobody else can enter. It is not dramatic. It is not the material of great cinema, but in that quiet room at 2 in the morning, it is enormous. The second thing is related but distinct, and it troubles people at 70 in a different way than they expected it to. It is the hours they gave to work that should have gone to children. Not the obvious missed events. Every parent carries some version of that. It is the texture of the ordinary time, the Tuesday evening reading that got replaced with a late call. The Saturday morning that disappeared into a project nobody remembers now. There was always a reason at the time, a good one, usually. The reasons were real, but at 70, reasons have a way of becoming considerably less convincing than they once were, while the ordinary Tuesday evenings that went somewhere else have a way of becoming considerably more visible. A man I knew for many years, someone who had built a genuinely successful business, the kind that appeared in regional magazines and generated real pride, told me once, very quietly, that he would trade all of it for 6 more months of being 41 and paying attention, not the dramatic moments, the Tuesday evenings. The third regret is one that people guard especially carefully, perhaps because it requires admitting that they allowed something small to take something large. It is the grudge that lasted too long. The silence between siblings that began over something specific, an inheritance handled badly, a word said at a funeral that landed wrong, a misunderstanding that calcified over years into an arrangement both sides called simply how things are. By 70, many of these silences have lasted so long that neither side is entirely sure what the original disagreement was actually about. But the habit of the distance has become its own kind of inertia, and crossing it would require admitting that years were spent on something that could have been resolved with a phone call made in the first 6 months. That phone call gets heavier with every passing year. At 70, it can feel almost impossible to lift, but I have never yet spoken with anyone who finally made it and said they wished they had waited longer. The fourth thing, and this one surprises people when I mention it, because it does not fit the usual narrative of aged regret, is not a relationship they neglected, but a version of themselves they quietly abandoned. It is the thing they loved before practical considerations arrived and rearranged the furniture of their life. The music they played in their 20s that got set down when the first real job required evenings. The painting that got moved to the garage when the children needed the spare room. The language they were learning the summer before everything changed. These things were never loudly surrendered. There was no ceremony, no decisive moment of giving up. They simply became gradually less possible and then gradually less mentioned and then simply not there anymore, in the way that fog disappears too slowly to observe and too completely to deny. At 70, these abandoned things sometimes return not as longing exactly, but as a quiet wondering. Who might I also have been? The fifth is one that most people would deny if you named it directly, but that lives in that quiet room all the same. It is the energy spent across decades caring what people thought. Not the obvious cases, not the reasonable social awareness that helps people navigate a world that requires some cooperation. The other kind. The adjustments made to choices that were already correct. The muffled version of an opinion offered to avoid disturbing the room. The path not taken because someone whose approval has long since become irrelevant might have raised an eyebrow. At 70, a person can look back across the accumulated landscape of those small adjustments and see, with a clarity that was not available at 40, what the total cost of all that caution actually amounted to. It is usually more than they had estimated. The sixth regret is the apology that was never delivered. Not because the person who owed it was cruel or indifferent, almost none of them were, but because apology requires a particular kind of courage that is somehow harder than most other kinds, and because there was always a reason to wait, they were not ready. The other person seemed fine, time would probably handle it, and then more time passed and the debt grew quietly larger, and the moment when it might have been easy retreated further into memory, and now the person it was owed to is either gone or so distant that the conversation would require explaining itself across years of silence first. Those undelivered apologies do not disappear. They simply change address. The seventh is friendship. Specifically, the friendships that died not from conflict but from pure neglect. The slow withdrawal of maintenance that nobody intended and everybody allowed. There was a friend from 30 years ago whose company meant a great deal, whose humor nobody else has quite replicated, whose voice on the phone always produced something that could fairly be described as relief. And there was always a reason that the last call was the last call. A busy season, a move. A mutual understanding never stated that the friendship would resume when things settled. Things settled. The friendship did not resume. A few of these lost friendships have become a kind of private archaeology, the mental excavation of someone you used to know so well that you once spoke to them without preparing anything to say. Nobody warns you that ordinary friendships require maintenance the way cars and houses and marriages do. By the time you understand it, some of the best ones have already gone quiet. The eighth thing people regret at 70 is gentler than the others but runs surprisingly deep. It is the trips that were deferred. Not the extravagant ones, though those appear too, occasionally, but the specific places that held a particular meaning and that kept getting scheduled for a better year. The town in Portugal that someone whose opinion you trusted described once over dinner in a way that stayed with you. The national park that was always going to be next summer. The road trip that was absolutely happening once the kitchen renovation was finished. The kitchen renovation was finished. Something else arrived. The road trip remains on a list somewhere, in the handwriting of someone slightly younger than you are now. Bodies and bank accounts and energy levels are not permanent. Most people understand this intellectually for decades before they understand it in the way that changes behavior. The ones who understand it early enough to act on it are not especially wise, usually. They are mainly lucky. The ninth regret is quieter than the others and takes longer to find the right words for. It is the moments of beauty that went unregistered. The sunset noticed from a commuter train that would have been extraordinary if anyone had been paying attention to it. The child's face at a particular age that was photographed but never quite seen. The decade of mornings that went directly from alarm clock to obligation without a single one being held in the hand for a moment and examined. Life, it turns out, does not shout. It offers. And the offering is easy to miss if you are moving quickly, which most people were, for most of the years when the best offerings were made. At 70, certain people develop a quality of attention that younger people sometimes mistake for slowness. It is not slowness. It is the late and expensive education of someone who finally understands what was available all along. The 10th thing is the body. Specifically, the agreement most people had with their body during the years when it performed without complaint. The silent understanding that its reliability was permanent and required no particular investment of gratitude or care. The extra weight carried for one decade that became the foundation of a problem in the next one. The sleep that was consistently sacrificed in the years when rest would have compounded. The doctor's appointment that kept getting rescheduled because nothing was wrong yet. Nothing was wrong yet is one of the most expensive phrases in the English language, and it is most often spoken by people in their 40s and 50s who are borrowing against a credit they assume is unlimited. The body keeps honest records. The bill always arrives eventually. At 70, most people are paying for transactions made 30 years ago. And then there is the 11th regret. The one that underlies all the others in a way that takes years to fully see. It is the belief in someday. Someday I will have the conversation. Someday I will make the call. Someday I will take the trip, pursue the thing I love, give myself permission to spend an afternoon exactly as I choose without accounting for it to anyone. Someday I will stop waiting for the right circumstances and simply begin whatever it is I have been delaying since the last time I deferred it. Someday is where most of the things on this list were sent to wait. And they waited there patiently and without complaint, while the years continued to pass at the entirely predictable rate that years have always passed and will always pass. Someday is the most expensive word most people will ever spend. Because unlike every other purchase, you never receive a receipt. You only discover the cost when the account has been emptied and the teller informs you with complete neutrality that there is nothing remaining. I do not say any of this to place sadness in a room where you came looking for something else. I say it because I have found, in my own life and in the lives of the people I have been fortunate enough to know well and long, that the purpose of regret, properly understood, examined honestly in that quiet room and then carried back into the light, is not to compound the loss. It is to clarify what the remaining time is actually for. Every one of the regrets I have described today is also a map. The unsaid thing is a map back to someone who has not yet heard it. The abandoned music is a map back to a part of yourself that has not gone anywhere, only gone quiet. The deferred trip is a map to a Tuesday that could still be different from the Tuesday you are currently planning, but the understanding it produced about what friendship requires is available to be applied anywhere there is another person whose company you value more than the inertia of your current routine. Regret, I have come to believe, is not the opposite of a good life. It is frequently the most honest evidence that you knew, somewhere under the business of everything else, what the good life actually contained. The people who carry none of it have usually not been paying close enough attention. What matters, what has always mattered, what the quiet room at 2 a.m. is actually trying to tell you, if you will listen to it without fleeing back toward sleep, is what you do with the clarity it offers. Not everything on the list can be addressed. Some doors are closed in ways that are permanent and require grieving rather than action. But some of them are considerably more open than they appear from a distance, and the distance is often what makes them look closed. The call can still be made, the apology can still be offered, even awkwardly, even late, even across years of silence that will make the first sentence difficult to find. The Tuesday evening can still be given to someone who would notice the difference. The thing you abandoned in a drawer somewhere, the instrument, the canvas, the half-filled notebook, the language that got as far as conversational before life interrupted, is still waiting in exactly the condition you left it. And someday, that expensive and endlessly deferrable word is available to be retired as of this afternoon. You are not too late to begin something. You are not too far along to change what an ordinary morning looks like. You are not required to carry every one of these quiet regrets through whatever years remain without examining what they are asking you to do. They are asking you something. That is why they return in the quiet room rather than staying quietly wherever they are stored the rest of the time. Listen to them. Not with guilt. Guilt is rarely useful past the age of 70 and rarely was before it. With honest curiosity instead. With the simple willingness to ask, in the straightforward manner of someone who has earned the right to be direct with themselves. Given everything I now understand, what do I actually want to do with today? The answer to that question is not the same for everyone. It was not the same for the retired engineer in Ohio or the librarian in northern Michigan or the man who would trade his business for 6 more Tuesday evenings at 41. It is personal and specific and yours in a way that no list, however carefully assembled, can entirely anticipate. But the question itself is the same for everyone, and the willingness to ask it honestly in the quiet room or the bright morning or wherever it finds you is all that is required to begin moving in a direction that has something genuine at its center. You have earned that direction. You have paid for it in the very currency I have been describing today. Take it. Spend it carefully and with full attention the way that only someone who has learned the cost of carelessness ever truly does. Take good care of yourselves, my dear friends. Let the list sit with you a while, not as a wound, but as a compass. And if something in it pointed at something real, give yourself permission to take one quiet step toward it before the day is done. Until we meet again.